Through his written work, John Updike has been commenting on American culture and politics for decades. His short stories, reviews, and poetry have appeared in the New Yorker magazine since 1954. And over the years, his books have been awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the National Book Award, and the National Book Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Mr. Updike's latest book, titled Still Looking: Essays on American Art, was recently published by Knopf. Next, a 3-hour conversation with author and critic John Updike.
John Updike, in the past several months, whenever I've told people that you and I were going to have this opportunity to spend 3 hours together, the first thing they say when I say your name is rabbit. For someone, as our opening just indicated, who has been so prolific, is it a joy to have created a character that is so well known, or is something other than that for you?
No, it's a joy, and I'm very grateful to Rabbit for the prizes he's won and the fact that the books have done well. And they were a pleasure to write, too, as I remember it. It's been a while since I wrote one, but when after a gap of 10 years I'd pick one up, somehow he was ready. I had him named. I had his wife and friends named, and so in a way you have a running start. And something about that imaginary area always excited me. It was exciting to be in Brewer and its environs somehow. It all savors of my boyhood terrain, and so in a sense it was deeply familiar to me. And one thing or another, no, they were fun to write, and as books go, fairly easy to write. I did feel that maybe 4 was enough. In fact, the last word of the 4th book is enough, but then I added a kind of a half book, a novella, 10 years later. But I used to resent it when people would murmur, "Rabbit, rabbit," when I go by, which doesn't happen too often anymore. I'm not really exactly like him. A lot of his thoughts and mine are shared, and we have the same rough background, but he stayed and I left, I guess is one way to put it.
Every 10 years, readers were at least treated to a look back on the decade filled with historical features of the decade and an understanding through his eyes of some of your thoughts of that. Will you catch me up to date on your view of America right now, 2005?
People ask me what would Rabbit make of Iraq and Bush and all that, and I really don't know. A lot of Rabbit's observation is about the small changes in women's dress. He's very interested in women and how they dress, and there have been quite a few changes in what is permitted and encouraged, in fact, among female dress. I remember he was very struck by the roller skating, the online skating phenomenon, and women began to jog outside. So I don't know what he would see now. Certainly he would, as he was loyal to Nixon during the Vietnam years, he'd have to be fairly loyal to Bush, but maybe less so. You know, all passion spent in a way. The older you get, the calmer you get, and the less real news items become. One thing that strikes me as a writer is how computerized the world has become in the 50 years since I've been writing, and really in the last 20. Suddenly I feel, for almost the first time, out of it. I don't really understand how to move around on the internet. I don't really dig the lingo. So I'm in that unfortunate position for being an American writer, of being in a way locked out of the now of it and increasingly locked into the then of it.
My question actually was not so much how Rabbit would have viewed America, but how you're feeling about the country now.
I think Iraq is kind of like a headache that won't go away, and all those headlines, 10 more, 6 more Marines killed, is very painful, especially since it's hard to see progress or put any very clear label on our objective. I was an adolescent in World War II, which had no such problem. It was very clear: beat the Japs, beat the Nazis, kick Hitler out. And now in this more ambiguous and ambivalent world, I've been a Democrat all my life, and so I wouldn't be sorry to see George Bush for all of his good qualities. He does have many good qualities, really, and he's able to make contact with, I think, the average American in a way not every political candidate put forward by the Democrats does. That said, though, I wouldn't be sorry if the Democrats weren't elected in 2008, and I'll follow with interest the elections in 2006.
Your current book is a collection of essays on American art, but I've heard that you've already talking about a book that you've finished and sent to the publisher for spring, which is a book about a terrorist.
It's called Terrorist. It's about a terrorist, only one. I mean, it's not exactly a thriller, although I may need to be kind of exciting toward the end. But it's really about an 18-year-old boy in northern New Jersey who is the product of a mixed marriage. His mother is an Irish-American redhead, kind of arty and flighty, and the father is an Egyptian fellow student who abandoned her and the infant boy at his age of 3. So he's become, out of loyalty to the absent father, a Muslim, and well, take it from there. I don't want to tell the whole plot, and it's a plot of which I had to kind of feel my way, since I'm not a native of northern New Jersey, nor indeed a resident, nor am I a Muslim, but I tried to bone up on the areas where I wasn't too familiar, and it's meant to be a kind of a take on terrorism now and the whole world situation, really, the angry Islam, and beyond angry Islam, I think the fact that the world seems more and more painfully and starkly divided between the haves and the have-nots, so that I take indeed the whole Arab resentment of the U.S. is one facet of the general resentment of the third world for the first world, which finds itself coping with unwelcome immigrants and racial minorities that they never. This is more Europe, not America. But yeah, it's a world in process, as the world always is.
I wonder, you mentioned the internet before. We live in an age of lots of raw information coming at us as interested citizens, from live reports to raw data on the internet. Where does your art fit in for an understanding of the world in a time like this with so much raw information coming at people?
Well, how much raw information gets to me, probably a lot less than gets to you, but I do read the newspaper. An old habit which I picked up from my grandparents many years ago, and I tried to watch the TV news, although I don't always get it. And to that extent I try to keep up, but I'm not really very politically savvy or interested in a way. I am interested in the American phenomenon, in this nation of 200 years plus old, and a kind of experiment. In fact, not a kind, it was really an experiment when it was created, and where's it going to go now? As a patriotic, really, American, even an old-fashionedly patriotic one, I'm concerned to read that the world hates us. I don't see much evidence of that in Europe, by the way, where I just was, but maybe I didn't expose myself to it. I was one tourist, and tourists are kind of welcome, and people are generally pleasant. But I think it's true that the American virtue, both strength and goodness, is in question now, and I'm sad to see that. Sad, but perhaps it's inevitable that no country can remain top dog forever, and to remain top dog in terms of power is one thing, and to remain top dog in terms of morality is another. I think we were a symbol of opportunity, and immigrants seem to still want to come here. It's still there are more people trying to get in than trying to get out. But there's a certain tarnish on everything now. That maybe will go away.
For the reader, then, for those people out there who are picking up your novels, how do they help them in this world, understand this world?
depends a little bit on which novel they pick up. Certainly, all of them begin with some sense that I have some news to impart, some information as far as the texture of life or the incidentals of life, to what you can't write a novel without feeling you're telling something that hasn't been quite said that way before. Rabbit Run was written because I, through my father's eyes, as well as my own experience, had observed that there are a number of Americans who were great athletes and sort of stars as adolescents had anticlimactic lives. And so I tried to write about one. It was based in part upon the experience my father had gathered in many years of being a school teacher. He'd bring back these tales of this and that old star fallen on bad days. So Rabbit was to me a kind of American and a kind of symptom, really, of what might be wrong. It's not a terribly gung-ho book about Eisenhower's America. He feels stuck. I think a lot of people felt stuck back then in the 50s. And some people felt stuck in the 90s too. It's hard to indeed to be human and not feel at some moments stuck. But Rabbit was a kind of being stuck. And the book was ended on kind of an ambiguous hovering note. He's seen running, but you don't know quite what he's running to or what's going to happen next. And enough people asked me what happened next that I, after 10 years, with no better ideas. In fact, I tried to write a political book about James Buchanan, President Buchanan.
I think I have it here.
Yes, no, I love Buchanan. I did a lot of research, and really it was the most research I've ever done for a book, and I tried to get to understand the antebellum atmosphere and the maneuvers and so on. So Buchanan and I became very close, it seemed to me, but I couldn't produce the novel that I had meant to produce, a historical novel. Something about it struck me as phony in some deep level, so I couldn't quite write it. I made a play out of it, and in trying to write a novel then, I turned back to Rabbit. It was all rather impulsive and last minute, but with the second book well received, or for me, or fairly well received, I committed myself to a set of them. 4 I thought would be about right. You know, you never know how long you're going to live. I might not live to write 4. Now, embarrassingly enough, I've lived to write 5 if I'd wanted to, but I thought 4 was probably about right. It's a life. It's meant to be an American life.
Let me tell our audience how they can join in here. Mr. Updike will be with us fully for 3 hours. This is our in-depth program. And the idea of this is to involve your questions and comments for him. If you would like to do that by telephone, if you live in the eastern half of the United States, our number here is 202-737-0001. If you live in the western half, in the mountain or Pacific time zones, our telephone number for in-depth is 202-737-0002. You can also send us an email. booktv@cspan.org is the email address, and we'll include your questions right away. I guess we ought to get more of your roots on the record here before we get to some calls from our viewers. I heard you in an interview on NPR say that Pennsylvania is not an ironic place.
Yeah, I said that to Susan Stamberg very impulsively, and I don't know quite what I meant, except it was a place where people were serious. They worked hard. A lot of the people in my area of Pennsylvania were of German ancestry, and they brought that German work ethic and also a little of the German solemnity to it. Earnest, yes, you were taught. There was a rigidity even to it, and the kind of irony that has been common to my short life in New York and my long life in New England, you don't encounter in Pennsylvania. But there is humor. There may not be ironical humor quite. I don't know. I found writing about Pennsylvanians much easier than writing about any other kind of people state-wise.
Father was a school teacher, but the way you've described it is that every year he was required at the end of the semester to quit his job.
That was during the Depression. I think it was a way of keeping the salaries from rising somehow, but it was mentioned in my childhood home more than once. And he was the son of a Presbyterian minister who had had a hard time making a go of that. So my father was haunted by what he perceived as the failure of his own father to measure up to American standards of success and enterprise. So he began his post-college career by being a telephone lineman. And he kind of liked that. He liked to be on the move, and he liked climbing the poles, I think. Although not in my blood to climb telephone poles, but it was in his. So he took up school teaching as sort of a resort, a last resort, really. Sorry, getting an elderly throat. The short of it is he was running scared financially for much of his life. I don't think they asked him during the war. During the war, everything got fatter and easier, and maybe they stopped firing him so that. But he did remember. I remember the figure. It was $1,200. He made $1,200 a year, and not just I and my mother, but her parents, all 5 of us, lived on that, plus what he could make in the summer. And I think that my grandfather, who was a fairly hale and hearty elderly man, also worked for a while. So, but it was a pinch. They were pinched circumstances that I grew up in. I was when I later talked to my father about it and he apologized for not getting me a good bike. A Schwinn, I think, was the bike he wanted to have gotten me, and I said, and I had an Elgin instead. Both probably makes that have long vanished. But I said I thought it was nice. I said I always had everything I wanted and was happy, and he said, "Oh no, Johnny, we were poor." And this notion of being poor was very much part of the ambiance of my growing up.
For people wanting to know how you got into writing, your mother, I have a photograph that you've brought of her and yourself. Your mother was a master's educated but worked in a local department store.
Yes, she was very precocious. She was an only child, as indeed I was, and ripped through the country schools around where she grew up, which was in southern Berks County, and went to Kutztown, then called Kutztown Normal School, and got out at, I think, 15, and then went at 16 to Ursinus, where she met my father. So she had this record of educational aptitude in a way, and I don't know at what point in her life she became intrigued with the notion of being a writer, but certainly by the time she was in college, and she took a master's at Cornell, and in English Lit, her thesis was on The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott, but it was out of Cornell that she emerged with the wish to be a writer. But the attachment, the magnetism between my 2 parents that had occurred almost during freshman registration remained, and they got married at some point in her postgraduate life. I'm not quite clear when it happened. There's actually, between my birth in 1932 and their graduation in 23, I think, from Ursinus, there's quite a gap of years. But yeah, she wanted to be a writer. That's the long and short of it.
And in fact, it was her working on short stories and working at the typewriter that are one of your earliest memories.
I remember being in bed with a fever, and if you were sick in bed, you got the privilege of being in the front room in the Shillington house. And that was also where her desk was. And there I was, feverish, but a child and interested in communicating. And I tried to talk to her while she was writing, and she was, for her, kind of severe with me, suggested that I could stop talking now. And that was my introduction to the writer's life. Yeah, I watched her type those things, and I saw the typewriter that she had, a little Remington portable, and the smell of it and all this, the paper, the stacks of paper that you buy. There was, I don't know, that whole era, the kind of physical things that interested us. But I remember going into Hint's stationery store. Maybe it was called Office Supplies, but I remember it was a stationery store, and the racks of kinds of paper, the kinds of typewriter erasers, the pencils, all that had a romance for me when I was 6, let's say, that has remained now that I'm 72. I still get, or 73, pardon me. But yeah, it was the tools and the effort and the pleasure of mailing something that then it came back. Well, that was too bad, but it was the mailing, the notion of being in contact with a wider world, I think, that while still remaining in your little cave. You could be a cave person and hide and shy, as she and I both were, but you also could send out these feelers to the world at large.
Last topic before calls, and we've got folks stacked up to talk to you already, but is on this magazine, The New Yorker. Aunt Mary was responsible for bringing it into that household in Shillington. Can you tell me about the influence that it had on a young John Updike?
Yeah, my Aunt Mary was my father's only sister, and she was rather sophisticated. She actually had worked for the New Republic for a while, and they lived in Greenwich, and so she knew about the New Yorker, and decided that both my mother and I could benefit from a subscription, and I think it began to come in the war years, in let's say 42. I would have been 10 in 42. I remember, let's say it was 44, even I was 12, but at any rate I was impressed by this kind of magazine, which was seen to me to be much more elegant, cool. The word cool wasn't around, but it was cool as opposed to the Saturday Evening Post, which was kind of hot with all of its refrigerator ads and pictures of housewives and illustrated stories. So I was drawn to it even before I was really wise enough to read much of it with pleasure, but I did look at the cartoons. I was a would-be cartoonist at that point in my life, and I fell in love, it's not too much to say, with the New Yorker. And my ambition when I came out of college was simply to get something into the New Yorker. A fairly humble, you might think, ambition, but not really. I got a lot of rejection slips already from then, so I knew it wasn't an easy market to crack. But it seemed to me very worthy and much really the only magazine to aspire to. It's a crass thing to say since, there are many good magazines, but for me the New Yorker was it. And as with a narrow ambition, often you get sometimes what you pray for, and I did get into the New Yorker, and I've been in it off and on ever since.
Quite regularly ever since, to be more honest about it. But will you, in closing, last question I promised for audience before calls, explain how it was that Catherine White, the great New Yorker editor E.B. White, came to you as you were a student in England to ask you to interview for a New Yorker position?
The first story and the first poem I wrote after I graduated from Harvard in '54 were accepted. And so I became a contributor, and you look very different to the New Yorker when you've gotten anything into the magazine, because they know it's not easy. And that year in England, I was being an art student, but also trying to move my writing career forward, and did get a few more stories accepted, and a number of poems actually. Light verse was still in vogue, and I was very keen to write lots of light verse. But it was the stories, I think, that showed them that I was, in their terms, promising. The Whites happened to be in England, I forget why. It certainly wasn't only to see me, but maybe not to see me at all. But at any rate, they both came to our basement flat along Iffley Road in Oxford, and I was in awe, of course, of E.B. White. His wife wasn't as real to me, although from reading One Man's Meat, I sort of read descriptions of her and so on, and I knew she was an editor. And they just offered me a job. The New Yorker was like that then, maybe like that still, kind of proprietorial toward people that thought could help the magazine, and they were interested, always are out for young blood if you can find it, and I was at that point a young, promising writer. It was an awesome visit. We had my first wife and I had a infant girl, and we had to get a babysitter so we could go out to lunch with the Whites. E.B. White came in and inspected the girl and approved of her, and out we went. The job was where most fledgling writers began, in Talk of the Town, as a Talk of the Town reporter. A reporter was somebody who would go out and do the legwork and the interview if there was one, and then submit perhaps a 6-page account, which then would be boiled down into 3 pages of New Yorkerese by one of the staff writers like Brendan Gill or John McCartan. And I was enough imbued with the New Yorker spirit that I was able to write in the New Yorker talk manner that I became very quickly a talk writer, which was a different status. I was on a drawing account. I didn't have to show up every day. I just got a salary, so ridiculously small by today's money, but quite enough for me then, $100 a week, and that was set against what stories they took. And so it was a very pleasant, turned out to be a job I had some aptitude for, which not every promising fiction writer has. But that was it. I loved being in New York because that's where I wanted to be. I loved being in the New Yorker offices because that was where I'd wanted to be. But after 2 years, it was kind of a dead end for my wife and daughter. I mean, living in New York is work, and a lot of work, even then. And my friends were mostly colleagues, and my wife had very few friends. And one thing or another, I also thought that although I was never going to get much better at writing talk stories than I was at that moment, that it was a genre I enjoyed, but it was a limited genre. So to end the story of my life, I had the revelation that we should get out of New York and try to live modestly and let me freelance, see if I could do it and maybe write a novel or two. And my wife said okay, and we moved up to New England, and there I've stayed.
Let's get to some telephone calls, beginning with one from right here in Washington, D.C. You are on the air for John Updike. Good afternoon. Washington, go ahead, please. Yeah, I think it's my responsibility to push the button. Washington, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thanks.
Mr. Updike, I'm a big fan of your books. I especially like The Centaur, and the book you wrote about your childhood self-consciousness was a wonderful book. I wanted to ask you about when you were first writing and when you left the New Yorker. I read once an interview that you did where you said you always wanted to draw or write for a living. Were you ever fearful that you just your novels wouldn't make enough money that you could survive? That was my first question. And the second question, when you first started out in the 1950s, were there any writers who were well-known then who have fallen into what you think is unjustified oblivion? People that were big in 1955 or 59 who we just don't hear about anymore.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Let me try to tackle the first part of it, if I might. It was the 1950s, and I was optimistic. I was in my early 20s, and the notion of failure was certainly there as a possibility, but you don't operate on the assumption that you might fail. You operate in the hope that you will succeed. I did not set out to be a novelist. I did set out a long time ago to set out to be a cartoonist, and 4 years at Harvard persuaded me that my aptitudes, if any, lay with the written word rather than the drawn image. I wanted to be a magazine writer. As I've already said, I wanted to write for the New Yorker. That was about the summit of my ambition. It was only after several years of being a magazine writer that I thought that I maybe should try to write a novel. A novel was the white whale that Americans were expected to land. It was the ultimate. It was Mount Everest. And so I wrote one novel while I was working in the New Yorker offices called Home, and I was very faithful. I showed up early, and before I did my talk stuff, I would write 3 pages of this novel. But in the end, it seemed better to let it go. It was a young, it's a young person's novel. It was somewhat about my parents and my life up to then. So I abandoned that, but I did then, once I'd moved to New England, settle down and write a short experimental novel, and others followed. But I've never, or let me change that, I didn't for the first 15, 20 years of my writing life expect the novels to support me. I thought that the trade was to be a magazine writer, a short story writer, a poet even, because my poems brought in something, and that the novels have rather slowly begun to loom as enough. The first novel, and really the only one that was a real bestseller, was a book called Couples, which came out in '68 when I had already been, around as a writer for over a decade. As to your second question, There was a kind of image that came out of the literary world of America different than now. I weaned myself on the joke books of Bennett Cerf, for example. He was a very gregarious man. He was a New York publisher, but also a storyteller, and he took it upon himself to assemble books of humor. A lot of the jokes involved writers, the Round Table. I think a lot of those writers are relatively faded now. I don't know how many young people have read Dorothy Parker, how many have read Benchley, how many have read Perelman even. He was not a member of the Round Table, by the way. And certain writers who were quite big in my vision, John O'Hara, for one, who came from nearby Schuylkill County, and he was proof that a Pennsylvanian could become a national writer. I don't know how many people read O'Hara still. Probably some read the short stories, which are magical. But as a novelist, I would say he's probably pretty well faded. Another writer who was quite big in the 50s was Thornton Wilder, who could do anything. His plays were on Broadway and revived, and you did them in high school auditoriums, and also his novels were much admired, and I don't know how much he's read still. Pearl Buck is another giant reputation that has since somewhat subsided. But reputations do subside is one of the conclusions I've drawn, that your life as a famous writer, like your life as a human being, is limited. And now that we all live so long, a lot of us live to see ourselves become faded reputations. I don't know if that's true of me or not. I try not to think about it too much. William Dean Howells, quite a great American writer, lived to see himself ridiculed and condescended to by younger writers. So as I see, there's a turnover, and I love the Reading Public Library and read through whole shelves of P.G. Wodehouse and mystery novels and humor and all that stuff that was very congenial to me. And I went back recently thinking I'd find those same shelves and the same books still there that I had read, and of course I was wrong. They've all been replaced by people like me who've come along since. And so there's a turning to the literary life.
Our next call for you comes from San Diego. You're on for John Updike. Good afternoon.
Hi, Susan. How are you this morning?
Fine, thank you.
Always enjoy listening to you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Updike.
Good morning.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you may know that Tom Wolfe was on this show some 6 months ago or so.
Oh, sacred presence, yes?
Yeah. And his book, The Painted Word, kind of gave us a sort of a negative response, a kind of a tacit. He said that it was a tacit scam by the art critics and things to hike the value of art. And of course, on the back flap of your book, in the upper part of it there's a little quote by Arthur C. Danto, who praises the book with a little quietude. But he now has been for like 20 years promoting a negative aspect. Is basically saying that that art is dead today and has no real meaning for us anymore. And so I want to ask, how can you remain positive while others go so negative in the pictorial arts?
Well, if you look at the new book, it's mostly painters and some sculptors who are long dead. I think the last school that I could relate to with excitement was pop art, which is quite a while ago now. But I loved pop art. It was kind of a relief after abstract expressionism, which I was afraid I wasn't quite getting. I lived in New York in the 50s and often went back to New York, and so I went to MoMA a fair amount and tried to keep up with what was in. And I enjoyed pop art because it seemed to me to do a little bit what I was trying to do in my fiction, which was glorify the ordinary, to tell Americans what they're really seeing, what they're really living among. These artifacts, these pop artifacts are like nature now. This is our grass and birds, the Coke bottles and Brillo boxes and things like that. But since then, I couldn't argue very strenuously with the notion that I wouldn't say art is dead, but art is drifting, certainly. It's drifting into various kinds of eclecticism, and it's a little The trouble with it, in a way, is like what's wrong with a lot of writing, is that the writers have read too much, and there's too much backlog in their heads of the classics or the would-be classics, and so it is in painting now. Every painter is ferociously conscious of all the styles that have preceded his in the last 100 years, let alone the last 1,000 years. So it's, in a way, almost that art needs a kind of a cleansing of forgetting, let's say, a wonderful forgetting of other art and somehow starting from scratch.
Maywood, New Jersey, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. I, too, want to thank Mr. Updike for his memoir, Self-Consciousness. And I was wondering, because we talked a lot about his fiction and stuff, which I would like to ask him a couple questions, but I was wondering, how do your contemporaries feel about your role as a critic? And how is that, because I think you've been a very good critic, aside from a great fiction writer, how has that role been for you? How does that fit in with your fiction? And also I wanted to ask you, do you feel there's going to, as a contemporary writer nowadays, do you feel there's more of a need than ever as a fiction writer to deal with the political, because we're in such a different type of world as opposed to, say, Cold War and earlier periods in our history?
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot to mull over. Let me go back to your first question, which was, how do other writers feel about me as a critic? I think I began it in about 1960 because I didn't think the criticism I was reading was quite good enough. I didn't like the way I was reviewed often, and thought there was something, even in the New Yorker, even in the sacred New Yorker, that there was sometimes a cursory skimming of, failure to really get with what the author was trying to do. So I found myself complaining to William Shawn, complaining in a very soft way about the reviews, and he asked me if I thought I could do any better, and I said, well, let's try it. And so he sent me a few books which I reviewed. The first one was actually a book of parodies, literary parodies, and it took a while to figure out what I felt competent to review, but it turned out I felt competent to review almost anything. I didn't know I had all this brashness in me and such a wealth of the opinion generating faculty, but I seemed to have it, and gradually, as other reviewers died off or faded away, I became a staple and did many more than I ever wanted to. My mother didn't raise me to be a book reviewer, but I thought I could set, a kind of example of courtesy, let's say, courtesy and attentiveness, attention to the book. And so I've kept up with it. I've tried to avoid reviewing people I might meet. I asked not to have to review contemporary Americans, writers, because I tended to run into them, if only briefly, and also a friend. Can you really review a friend as impartially as you review somebody you don't know? So I asked that they favor me with foreign books or books by, experimental books. I was interested in what was going on in both Europe and Latin America at the time. I thought I could learn something about the art of fiction, and so my early book reviews dealt with that. I think it's made people pay a little more attention to me than otherwise, since I do have a power of pronouncing judgment. It's not a power I sought or one I exactly relish wielding, but I think it's made me a little more scary as a figure, and I find that
is that something you relish?
Slightly. Writer. People in the arts generally don't aspire to that kind of power, and for that sort of segues into my next thing about politics and fiction. But there tend to be bashful people who want to exert their spell from a safe place and not get out there on the podium or on a 3-hour television interview and expound their views, because a lot of them don't have any. You don't really have views. You have impressions. You have certain things that matter to you in your life. You have one life to sing and all of its, and you want to vary the song as much as you can, but basically you're not taking a stance politically that could be packaged as a dogma. No, but on the other hand, I enjoy, to finish with the reviews, I enjoy doing them. They, in a way, need to be shaped somewhat as a story does, so that there is a kind of artistic component in a review. What quotes you choose and what spin. I mean, you're really creating a story about a book, in a way, or about a set of books, about another author, and all of that borders on the artistic without being at the top of the mountain. But so it can be. It's been also, it's a good way to keep myself in trim, reading other people's books. I might not do that otherwise. I have a kind of lazy streak, so it's good for me to have to crank out a review now and then.
You know, that earlier caller referred to Tom Wolfe being on the program.
Yes.
We actually have a clip from that program with him talking about your critiques of his work.
Really?
Yeah, let's listen to what he had to say.
What you call the Three Stooges, we'll get into this maybe later, said this about The Man in Full, named John Updike back in '98. A Man in Full amounts to entertainment, not literature, even literature in a modest aspirant form, like a movie desperate to recoup its banker's investment. The novel tries too hard to please. That led you to say a few things about Mr. Updike.
What was interesting was that not just John Updike, but also Norman Mailer and John Irving, these three old men with secure literary reputations, suddenly pounced on a novel by somebody else. I do not think anything remotely like that had ever happened. And what you just quoted from Updike was the typical, the tenor of these three attacks, which was that, you know, this is not literature, this is journalism, this is entertainment, that charge doesn't bother me at all. I'm trying to put together a Hippocratic oath for writers. I guess it would be sort of an Aristophanic oath. You know, the Hippocratic oath begins, first do no harm. I think that's really interesting, that the oath for doctors is first do no harm. The Aristophanic oath for writers, the one I'm putting together, says first entertain. Entertain is a very simple definition. Entertainment is something that enables a person to pass the time pleasantly without physical effort. Is that too much to expect of something that's written and offered to people to read? I don't think so. You at least do that, then you can soar to the stratosphere if you have the talent. But first, entertain. And these novels had become so unentertaining that they just didn't like the fact that this book, A Man in Full, had sold 1.4 million copies in hardcover. You know, that couldn't be literature if it sold that much.
Reaction.
Many. He talks very well, doesn't he? No, he's a bright guy in a way, a dedicated writer, but he does suffer. I think if there was an animus in any of those three notices he gets, or in my review, it wasn't a book I wanted to review, by the way. I sort of tried to beg off. I didn't think I was going to like it. I don't like any big book that's that bulky, actually. And I said many kind things about it, so my idea wasn't to annihilate Tom Wolfe. He's too big, he's right there. I can't annihilate him. But he's written essays telling what's wrong with American fiction and how nobody is like Zola or Balzac except himself, implicitly, and maybe even explicitly. He says that, and so I think all of us other writers don't like being lectured, don't like being told what we're not doing. You do what's possible and what seems just and true to you. And Wolfe's novels, or at least the first, that one, had a kind of whipped up, overblown quality. The book, I sort of said it, he was trying too hard, I felt. I've not read the last one. Wolfe's charm and power as a writer are evident. I think his success as a journalist has led him to lean maybe too much upon research of a journalistic kind and not enough upon the inner man. the inner man. There was some of the inner man. The book is in a way about the South, and Wolfe is a Southerner. And so what was good and interesting about it was, in a way, that we tried to talk about the New South and the fact that in what ways it is new, in what ways it's not so new. So the book had merit, and I'm sorry that it was turned into a literary feud. Since I guess if I resent anything, I kind of resented the time it took me to read A Man in Full, and the fact that he didn't quite trust the material to ride along. And I do resent this notion that, which he has on a number of fronts, that modern art is just, it's the invention of people who are trying to annoy or humiliate us. He's written a little book on modern art in which he decries abstraction, basically, and says it's all a con game and so on. And I don't quite believe that. I believe that the strangeness of modern art and the strangeness in fiction as well is a product of, we haven't lived like this before. People haven't been people quite like they're people now. So that you need to find some new way to write and not just say, I want to write like an American Zola.
Beyond this public debate with Tom Wolfe over his work, do you hear frequently from people whose works you critique privately?
Very rarely, mercifully. In fact, I can hardly remember. There's once in a while I get a grateful review. I reviewed and quite liked a book by a man who's, I think, called Andrew Greer. I hope I have that right. It was about somebody who's born old and regresses to infancy, and he's in love first with his mother. I forget how it works, but it sounds very complex, and it is, but in fact it's very charming and scary. It's a whole new way to think about human experience, in that what I remember about it is that the woman he's loved all of his life, who was first his mother's age, they become contemporaries. As he goes down, she comes up, and then he perceives that he can only then become a child. Childhood is what's in his future, and maturity and even old age is in hers. And so this sense of losing something, losing your love object to the progress of reverse time. Anyway, he did write me a letter because he was pretty unknown, and there was also a Washington resident novelist who wrote a very good novel about Lincoln's assassination from the standpoint of the other couple who happened to be in the booth that night. And I've totally forgotten his name under the stress of this video experience. But anyway, he's quite good. But by and large, no, you don't hear much. And I try not to respond to reviews of me unless they're very kind and shrewd. You don't always get shrewdness and kindness together. But yeah, it's your service is not to the author, but to the prospective book buyer.
I'm going to ask you, we hear our questions from these little earpieces, and yours is starting to pop out of your ear. I want you to just tuck it in there, right in your ear, as we listen to our next phone call so you can hear it well. It's from Shreveport, Louisiana, and you're on for John Updike. Hello, caller.
Hello, Mr. Updike.
How do you do?
Such a pleasure. Among the great literary disappointments of the latter part of the 20th century and now the 21st century, at least for me, is that you have not received the Nobel Prize for Literature. Would you comment?
Go ahead.
On that disappointment for me.
Well, thank you for caring and for wanting. For a long time I thought it was something other people got, and really it was quite remote from my aspirations and even my realm of possibility. So I was spared worrying about the Nobel Prize. It was only in the last 10 years that I've seen myself mentioned as a possible candidate. So I then, once you're in the field, as it were, you'd like to win the race, wouldn't you? But I now know, which I didn't know for years, I know when the prize is announced, so I'm alert to alert to it. It's possibility. I think I'm past the moment when I might have gotten it for whatever reason. It generally goes to writers in their 60s. Some get it in their 50s. There's so many of us septuagenarian writers who are, worthy in our way, but who've been passed over. In my own experience as a judge is that the same names keep arising, and if it's the same name often enough, it becomes a name you're sick of hearing, and you move on to what you hope is a brighter, fresher, more surprising candidate. The Nobel began as a prize that was received half by Scandinavians and half by Europeans. It was extended to North America only in about the year I was born, when Sinclair Lewis won it, and they've gradually had to expand their horizons to include Asian writers, Japanese writers, African writers, South American writers. So their field that they must sift through is enormous, and yes, it would be a wonderful thing to win it, but I think I've pretty well given up hope.
Next question for John Updike is from Richmond. Good afternoon, caller.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you. It's a pleasure to get to chat with you, indeed. We have something in common. I was born in 29, and you, Mr. Updike, I believe in 31 or something like that?
32, actually.
32. I also take the New Yorker magazine because they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, several years for X number of dollars. Now, did you write Run, Rabbit, Run?
Yeah, I wrote Rabbit Run. The book is called Rabbit Run.
All the way, and the poor devil just didn't make out.
And have you read the book, sir?
I've read the books.
Yeah, and we missed your last comment. The poor devil didn't what?
I can't understand you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, appreciate your compliments. We're going to move on. And
you can't understand me?
I could understand his question here. Let me ask you one that came in by email, which is also makes reference to the Rabbit books. This is from a viewer in West Hartford, Connecticut, named Steve Metcalf, who says, in most of Updike's fiction, there is music, if only sporadically and in the background. For instance, Harry Angstrom notices that the Bee Gees' voices have become higher in Rabbit is Rich. Roger finds his wife listening to Pavarotti in Roger's version, and various party scenes make reference to specific pop hits of the day. Updike himself somewhere mentions his fondness for The Old Lamplighter, a ballad from the 40s. My question, we know a lot about Updike's relationship to the visual arts, but what about music? Are you an active concert goer? What recordings do you own?
I took piano lessons, as a lot of Depression kids did. It was sort of one of the ways that parents hoped their children could escape whatever small burg they were stuck in. And I did not have much aptitude for it. I stuck with it for quite a while. The woman across the street was a piano teacher, and so she just had to cross the street to come and give me my lesson. And my home was that kind of middle-class home that did have an upright piano in it. So I was a musical dunce, and I still marvel that men can sit down and write a symphony. I don't really understand keys. I don't understand orchestration. There's a lot that's just a closed book to me. But I have ears and listen, and I partook liberally of the pop music of my era, an era which is pretty well lost now in the archives of pop music. But The Old Lamplighter was certainly one of the songs that we sang and could sing the whole lyrics to. And then I had a second wave of music appreciation when my children matured, and we heard a lot of the Supremes and the Beatles and so on in the house, and I dug that. I've been slow to come to classical music, but my present wife has helped educate me, and we don't go to many concerts, but wish we could. We sit longing, wondering why we can't organize ourselves to get into Boston, but anything that involves not getting home before 10 has kind of become frightening to us. But I don't know much about music in general. I do know that it is, in a way, the purest of the arts, the one that lifts us out of ourselves most basically, somehow, and of course Rabbit and my other characters are aware of music in the background. But to me it is pretty much a background art and never one I hope to practice.
Tucson, you're up. Go ahead.
John, I've heard a compelling statistic. Half of the people alive on Earth have never made or received a telephone call. My question for you is, who is closer to the truth, those who have or those who haven't?
Well, our truth certainly lies in the direction of the telephone call and other kinds of call and electronic entertainment and all the rest of it. I think we all feel that that somehow this present wave of technology, or really the wave of the last 100 years, is somehow stretching the human animal in painful ways, and that a certain longing to go back to the telephone-free, car-free world is real. I was moved when I was 13 and a happy small-town dweller. I was moved to a farm didn't have a telephone, didn't have electricity even. It was an unimproved Pennsylvania farmhouse, and so I'd lived kind of with nature and the basics for a year or two before we got these things. My reaction to this state of deprivation was, I think, to get sick. I was quite sick that year, and with colds and things, and huddled by this kerosene stove we have that was the only heat in the house. I think that in answer to your question, humanity is moving, however imperfectly and partially, toward higher technology. We made it, we created it, we know how to use it, and we're stuck with it.
We're spending 3 hours talking with John Updike about his body of work over his lifetime. His most recent book is a book of art criticism called Still Looking, and available in bookstores now in this holiday season. Next telephone call is from Wausau, Wisconsin.
Oh, yes. Hi, Mr. Updike.
Hi.
My question concerns the role of religion in your writings. Why do you think that the theme of religion plays such a role? Is that your personal roots, or are you a student of theology? And if so, who are your favorite theologians? Also, as a follow-up, could you comment on the controversy concerning intelligent design and evolution? I think in a previous work you touched on sort of an analogous issue, Roger's version, if I'm correct.
Correct.
So if you can comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I was raised without terrific ardor as a Lutheran, and I've retained a grip on religion through several changes of denomination since. To me, it is part of being human, and my own life would be the poorer if I believed nothing. I think, or nothing of religious content. It also ties in a way with the practice of fiction, since ultimately why are we describing these unreal imaginary lives except to say that human life is important and it has a dimension to it that is beyond the animal and the mechanical. As to intelligent design, this question has really been out there for a number of years, and my own limited readings in theology or theological speculation have convinced me that there are several things about the cosmos. This cosmos, for example, is exceptionally well tailored for the creation of a planet like Earth and beings like us. It didn't have to be that way, and one little constant being off would throw it all off, and we'd have a very short-lived universe, or else a universe where nothing would coagulate and be in any kind of concentration of. So anyway, this is there, and I did write about it in Roger's version, and it's been a while since I wrote that book, and I can't elaborate much on what I was trying to say there. I think that what has happened since I wrote Roger's version is that the complexity of the basic cell of organic life has amazed people with its complexity. And so the question has again arisen, which has always been a theological staple, or at least in the last 500 years, of how could such a thing as marvelous as, say, the human eye, or really any of our physiological details, have come into being by accident. And Darwin came up with an answer, and it's an answer that holds up, although there are still gaps in the theory. I mean, there's been books about, which I've read about, Darwin's black box, and that he doesn't really explain. He explains how beaks of birds become different. Some get specialized for berries and others get specialized for worms, but he doesn't really go into basic parts of how did the whales develop baleen, for example, out of nowhere. I mean, why did it's a very specialized and highly engineered construct which appears nowhere else in nature. Anyway, for all this, and being sympathetic and aware that there are some mysteries to the organic science as it's set forth, I can't say that I don't think the attempt to rest prodigious faith upon a scientific observations is going to work. It keeps shifting as they know more and more. There's less and less ground, so that in the end, those of us who are in some sense Christians have to do it as an act of faith and an act of will to a degree.
In your memoir, Self-Consciousness, you write about your concept of God, and even as doing so, you suggest that perhaps you've gone too far in trying to attempt to describe him.
Yes, I forget quite what I say, but I was very shy about writing that chapter. In fact, the whole book was, every chapter is embarrassing in a different way, and it was embarrassing to try to discuss my religion, but I thought it was a part of me, and in a way slightly unusual, especially since my father was a great, although a clergyman's son, he also was a great believer in science, and I'm very aware of the majesty of organic science, materialistic science, what it's able to tell us and what it's still telling us. I get Scientific American, for example. I don't get any theological publications. So why am I so tenacious? In part fear. In part, it lifts. I've had chronic crises, which I may mention in Self-Consciousness. I forget what all I said in that very indiscreet book, but that the choice seemed to come down to believe or be frightened and depressed all the time. And it seemed to me that given the fact of life, I am alive now, I should maximize my use of my life and my identity, and religion is one way of maximizing it.
Yeah, I also remember reading that you saw that many organized religions that you were exposed to were religions of no, and you chose a religion of yes.
Yes, I guess I did. And that terminology I got from Karl Barth, who I found of the 20th century theologians to be the most comforting, also the most austere in a way, most uncompromising, but he does he does dismiss all attempts to make theism naturalistic, to actually draw it out of our own feelings or the grandeur of a tree or the human eye or any such thing. And it's very definite that it's scripture and nothing else. I find this hard to swallow, but I like to see Barth swallowing it, and I liked his tone of voice. So yes and no. He talks about the yes and the no in life, and says that he loves Mozart even more than Bach because Mozart expresses the yes of life.
In other words, the enjoyment of being alive.
Yeah, right.
Next telephone call, Phoenix. Hello, Phoenix, you're on the air.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, do you have a question for us?
I couldn't understand you.
Do you have a question? You are on the air.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm honored to speak to Mr. Updike. I'm going to make 2 comments and 2 questions, and then I'll hang up. Number one, you've impressed me. I assume that you would be one of those effete, elite East Coast intellectuals. You made a soft compliment for President Bush. I think you'll lose some friends over that, and you can forget about the Nobel Prize, which is strictly political. But I find your writing to be technically almost perfect. I had no idea you knew E.B. White personally, and that's probably your greatest asset, is that you had the greatness to have met a man such as that. I do say two things. I find your novels, and you've been a critic of other people yourself. I think Thomas Wolfe is one of the greatest living writers. I think technically you're perfect, but your novels to me are boring. I can't get through them. I don't mean that to hurt your feelings whatsoever. The other thing is poetry. You mentioned that right in the beginning. No one has brought it up. When I feel bad, when I feel like I'm depressed or very anxious, I pick up a copy of the completed works of T.S. Eliot, and I read the Four Quartets or Proof Rock or whatever. Could you name? I don't think there's been a poet since Pound or Eliot that matches that kind of quality. I'll leave now. I'm very nervous.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry my book struck you as boring, but the House of Fiction, like the House of God, has many mansions, and it's nice that there are so many books in a way. More and more, indeed, even as the death of reading is predicted. Publishers seem to be getting out more and more. So there's something to please everybody, and my advice when I'm asked about how do I get my child to read is to let them read, or him or her, whatever entertains them. And that's how I read. Certainly I did not have, although my mother was learned in her way, and tried to get me to read Flaubert and a few other classics. I persisted in reading mystery novels, humor, things that made sense to me and that spoke to me. So you're welcome to read whatever does not bore you. Poets, I'm no great expert on poets, so I must say in the New Yorker, I look at the cartoons, I read the book reviews, and I read the poems. So I am a poet still to that extent, and I still try to write it. Eliot, I love Eliot. I admire Eliot. I was my generation of college students regarded Eliot almost the way rock stars are regarded. To us, he was a star, and I remember standing in long line one winter night to hear him read a speech that was very Eliotic and very, you might say, boring. I fell asleep. In fact, I was so exhausted by the effort of getting in to hear him, but I wanted to do that because he was magical, and he had a kind of integrity and a kind of originality, kind of honesty, really, as well as a lovely ear and a wry sense of humor. But there surely have been a lot of poets of equal merit since. Wallace Stevens is about Eliot's age, but actually kind of bloomed later, and I think Stevens is quite a wonderful writer. Sylvia Plath has her admirers, me among them. She was just my age. Auden was he was a magician in a way, and he was very facile, which you could not say about Eliot. Eliot got those poems out very slowly, and you felt they came from a very deep self, whereas Auden was able to write charmingly and in rhyme about almost anything. But I do think poetry lost something when it gave up any attempt at rhyme and meter. That is, form in some way was the bottle that made the genie so powerful when it came out, and just writing prose strung down the page isn't quite enough to call that poetry, so that we miss, in a way, some of the tension that you feel even in Eliot, where the rhyme, the form is haunting the verse.
Hamptons Bays, New York.
Yes, it's a pleasure to talk to Mr. Updike, and I have a question. As a keen observer of things American and Americana over many years, where do you think America is going vis-a-vis the world at the present time?
Well, I don't want to think that it's becoming Fortress America. despised of all and besieged by many, I still think it's a wonderful experiment, the American experiment, in actually letting people call the shots. No more kings, no more dictators, just elected officials who can be changed every 2 or 4 or 6 years. And that what I love about America is that it does, in the end, although there are elites and there always will be powerful people and people more rich than others, that nevertheless the possibility of that a certain kind of basic worth is assigned to everybody. And even if we can't persuade every government in the world to imitate ours, the pop culture that we've produced, the fact that it does speak to people all over the globe, I think says something about the American spirit and about the benefits of freedom. I don't like pop music much now, the way it is. I did in my turn, but I'm too old for any of that. Yet I admire the way that our music is still the music that speaks to people all over the world, rich or poor. So I think I wouldn't sell out America. It's true, empires change, and there's a lot, as it happens on TV, about empires rising and falling, and I suppose any entity that rises does eventually fall. But I don't see America's fall, with all of its present troubles, and maybe some of its misdirection. I don't see it falling soon.
As you can see with our format, questions move from one topic to another here.
Very good for the answerer, isn't it?
The next one's close to home. The caller is from Shillington, Pennsylvania.
Really?
Hello, caller.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Okay. John, I haven't had an opportunity to read your memoirs, but I had your father as a teacher in junior high school. And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to have any courses with your father. He was known to be a little eccentric, I guess you'd say, when I was going to school. And if you've had any opportunity to talk about your father in the book, I'll be glad to read that.
Caller, what is your town like today, please?
Oh, pretty much the same it was when I was growing up. The town itself hasn't changed much. A lot of the small businesses, of course, have changed on Lancaster Avenue. And I still have an opportunity to drive by John's old home, although I think it's a little different now. Well, yeah, you're showing a picture. I didn't think it was white at the time, but I thought they repainted it. But yes, it's still pretty much the same.
And what subject matter did you take as a student from Mr. Updike?
That was a science class. I don't remember specifically what it was, but it was a science class.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, well, I'm always happy to hear from Shillington. I go back whenever I can, and you're right, it doesn't change an awful lot. It's changed on the edges a bit. Some of the fields that grew corn when I was a child now have grown houses, and there's a mall where the old poorhouse property used to be, but the core of it is certainly very little changed. I guess because they built it so solid, full of brick semi-detached houses, there was no room to put anything new, and it's very comforting. My father, as I said at the outset of this talk, did not set out to be a school teacher. He set out to be a lineman, and I think school teaching did not come as easily to him as it did to some other teachers of his era, like Mr. Schrack and Alan Richards, who were natural disciplinarians, and they had a way. They would usually instill fear in you the very first day of class by some stern rebuke or something, so that you ever after minded, as they say in Pennsylvania, you minded. There's my father pushing me along.
In front of the high school, as a matter of fact.
By the high school, right. I was fortunate in a way, really in almost every way, that I had my father as a math teacher for 3 years, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. He taught junior high math. I also had him as a homeroom teacher in, I think, the 8th grade. He had the what must have been a little awkward for him, he did have the problem of having a child in his class, but that generation or that particular class had a number of school teachers' children. Alan Richards was a classmate of mine, the son of J. Allen Richards, and Ann Wyke, the son of the assistant principal, was in my class. So we weren't alone, and we were good students too, which made it easier, I think, on the teacher-parent. That I observed, though, and if you read a book called The Centaur, you would know, I observed him suffering, as it were, in front of the class, and behaving in an eccentric way. He was, in a way, too much of an American, too much a believer in freedom, I think, to be as inhibiting as a good teacher should be. My father lacked the gift of discipline, but he had other gifts as a teacher. A lot of people still think of me as his son and come up to me at high school reunions. This is 55 years after I graduated, wanting to talk about my father and how much he meant to them. So I think as a success, as a teacher, he was a success in spite of himself, in a way.
Well, the questions are on your life. Here's one from a viewer named John Martin Joy, MD, who is a professor at your alma mater, Harvard. A psychiatrist who teaches residents at Harvard about development over the lifespan. And he writes, I've enjoyed your work for many years. In an interview perhaps a year ago, you mentioned that in passing that you believe you can do some things better at 70 than you could at 30. The conversation in that interview moved on before you could elaborate, but I've remained curious, he writes. What are you better at now compared to your earlier life, and in your view, what accounts for the development of these new strengths?
That's a very Harvardian question. It reminds me of my oral exams when I graduated from Harvard. I had had a good record as an English major, but I couldn't quite get into preparing for the oral exams, so I thought of them as a bit of a flop, and my mind went blank. The first thing that came to mind that you possibly can do better is, I think in a way I'm a better golfer at 73 than I was at 33. I understand about keeping the arms close to the body in a way I could never internalize. I was told when I took up the game that I had a beautiful natural swing, and my swing, I've been trying to find that particular bluebird ever since, the beautiful natural swing. So golf is something, one sport where taking thought actually can help. I'm probably approaching the point whereby my physical deterioration is such that I won't ever amount to much as a golfer, but I feel in some ways I'm better. I could be in ways a better writer too. I certainly now see, as I reread what I'm writing, what the critics were saying about me 40 years ago. I mean, I see that there is a tendency to use too many adjectives, and that sometimes a simple noun does it all. So I'm trying to learn how to be a better writer at a point when that's not likely to happen. I don't know as I'm a better family man, a better man to be with. I am increasingly, I suspect, preoccupied with my work, making a final statement. When I was in my 30s, I sort of wrote on the side. I was more interested in being a suburbanite and being a father of young children, of having fun in a way that my depression childhood didn't offer. I had a little money to spare, all that. So I wrote, yes, I kept writing because it was all I could do, all I did, but I wasn't passionately obsessed by it, and now I feel I am in danger of becoming obsessed. And no sooner is one book like just looking on the shelf than I'm shepherding the next one through the press and thinking about the third one. And so maybe I am becoming a better writer at last.
You know, I just looked through my stack of emails, and there's actually a golf question in here. You want to tackle it?
Yeah.
This viewer says, Mr. Updike has a long-standing affection for golf. What does he like about the game? And could you assemble a dream foursome?
What I like about the game is that it gets you outdoors, and it's something that even the elderly can compete at least with the other elderly. It's a sport that you can carry. As long as you can walk, you can play golf, which is not true of ice hockey or even tennis. So I've always loved the landscape of golf, I've always loved the look of a good shot as opposed to the many bad ones you hit. I've been always intrigued by the mystery of why the good shots occur and why they don't occur all the time. And the equipment, I like the wearing only one glove and shoes that used to rattle on the macadam but don't anymore because we've all gone to soft spikes. But I like and also the camaraderie. It gives me access to people that I really don't have an awful lot to say to professionally, but we have a lot to say on the golf course, and in a way you're kind of naked on the golf course. There's no disguising a bad shot. There's no disguising your exasperation. You try to put a good stiff upper lip on, but in fact your emotions are very evident, and your character and all that. So those are the reasons that I like golf, and I've been given a professional life that enables me to play a fair amount. Since I'm a self-employed writer, I can play a number of afternoons, try to play twice a week. Second question was...
a dream foursome.
A dream foursome. I don't want to play in a dream foursome because I'm not up to them, but I would say Sam Snead, the first name that comes to my mind, as being the epitome of a natural appearing swing. No swing is totally natural. In fact, it is not a natural motion, but Snead was my hero and my idol. Arnold Palmer, for charisma, not a good swing, but he made it work for a while. A wonderful attitude, wonderful expressive golfer. He really made you feel the joy and the challenge of golf. Tiger Woods certainly would be in that foursome, and wonderful to see a young man exposed to the limelight, golf limelight, so early, and so promising, actually live up to the promise, indeed even exceed the promise, and to watch him now struggle. Even the greatest golfer in the world struggles, is the moral of watching Tiger Woods closely. I love his spirit and his attitude. The fourth?
I think the fourth is you.
I guess there's going to be any kind of a foursome, but I would annoy these men quite a lot. I think they would get very sore at me. A golfer I'd love to see play with is an English golfer who, when the late Herbert Warren Wind would write about, greats of golf, he always named her as the greatest woman golfer ever was. And she was English and quit the game when she got married, had all kinds of upper class reticence and attitudes, but nevertheless had that perfect swing, the great, beautiful swing, which is what golf and maybe even life is about.
We have just a couple minutes left, and then we're going to take a break. Almost halfway finished, halfway through our 3-hour conversation with John Updike. Our next telephone call is from San Diego.
Hi, Mr. Updike. First of all, I thought the dream foursome might be you, Norman Mailer, John Irving, and Tom Wolfe. But, I didn't hear that answer. I have two related questions. I went to school in Iran and came here to go to college. So I became familiar with the main works of American literature. A few years ago, while Coliseum Bookstore in New York was still around, I was there and I asked one of the workers there, who was very helpful. I asked him if he could recommend some books, and he recommended Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut and J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. So I wanted to ask you, as a reviewer, if you could recommend some other works that I might have missed, not having gone through high school here, where these are high school requirements now. And also, again, as a reviewer, I heard your interview with Terry Gross a few years ago, and that's when I became more familiar with who John Updike was. But if you had to review your own work, and I don't want to corner you into anything, but if somebody had to read one of John Updike's books besides the Rabbit series, which one it would be?
Thank you.
Well, you didn't do badly, Slaughterhouse-Five and Catcher in the Rye. You might try Huckleberry Finn, which is a 19th century work, but Twain was very much admired by many American writers and very influential in really creating a kind of American language of fiction. He did, to some extent, for fiction or prose, what Whitman did for poetry. You should read some early Hemingway. I recommend Farewell to Arms, although it's rather a devastating end, but it's a beautifully written book, and probably some Faulkner, again, early Faulkner. He's more admired, I think, by professors of English than of readers now. I've never found him terribly congenial, but The Sound and the Fury is probably a classic that you should read.
And of your own books?
Of my own books, aside from the rabbits, well, I was to an Iranian, I might recommend The Coup, which I had a lot of fun with when I was writing it. It was a real try to get out of suburbia and small town America into a different kind of world. It was one of my few attempts to write a kind of global novel about the global situation as it was in the late 70s. So let me recommend The Coup, although I don't think it's very much read now. As I said earlier, a book of mine that was a bestseller was called Couples. It portrays American middle class, upper middle class at a certain moment. And of recent books, gee, I'd be able to come up with one. A book I'm very fond of because it was quite self-indulgent and kind of outrageous. It's called A Month of Sundays. It's about a minister who's been banished for bad behavior to Arizona.
Nashville, you're on for John Updike.
Yes, I had two questions. The first was going to be a golf question, but that has been answered. I will say I appreciate your golf book, which I've been buying copies of off the internet and giving to golf friends. It's a delightful short read.
Thank you.
Can you think of a protagonist who, if any, who reflects your religious or philosophical worldview in your fiction? Is there somebody that you would more identify with as reflective of your world outlook?
So in his body of work alone, you're looking for one of the protagonists that best reflects his view.
Mr. Updike's body of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, my religious views sort of change from day to day in a way. I would certainly offer Rabbit Angstrom as a character who, like me, is pretty vague about it and not especially observant of the fine print, but retains this feeling of transcendence, of there being something else, and his life should be something more. And there is a point, if you can just locate it, to your life. There is also the protagonist of a book called Roger's Version is a divinity professor called Roger Lambert, about my age. And he's like me, insofar as I have a theological position, and I certainly had it then, kind of a crusty Bartian who can't really respond to a young man coming to him with, well, what they now call intelligent design theories. So those two, Rabbit Angstrom and Roger Lambert, I would offer you. I just mentioned A Month of Sundays, which has a minister as a protagonist. And his view, which is basically that God will take care of him, is sort of close to mine as well.
We're going to take about 5 minutes here of a break from the studio, but tell you more information about Mr. Updike's career and life during that break, and then we'll be back to take another half program full of your calls.
you.